started, many of you know we are the only thing that stands between you and literally billions of United States Department of Transportation dollars. Secretary will be next on the agenda. My name is Lawrence Masal. I'm the president of the Civic Federation, which is a 118-year-old nonpartisan government research organization. We annually review and analyze the local government, the major local government budgets here in Chicago and Cook County and the state of Illinois. Very pleased to be here and be part of this very distinguished panel. I hope all of you have read the white papers, the drafts of the papers that are online. Richard Nathan's piece on the legacy costs or the price of early decisions really, I think, fleshes out the challenges that this panel is going to focus on. University of Illinois Press would like me to announce that all of the white papers will be published by the University of Illinois later this summer. So start looking around July 1st, and they will be published. So I think there is so much that we want to try to cover today in so little time. The idea of infrastructure and pensions and the legacy costs that they represent, not just for the state of Illinois, but also for our local governments and all around the country, is something that is of great concern to many of us. There's a saying in Illinois, especially around government, the only type of maintenance that we have in this state is deferred maintenance. And if you apply that to our pension situation, you would say the only type of pension funding we have in Illinois, or the major pension funding, is deferred pension funding. And that explains the big financial challenges that we face. As infrastructure and pension costs and funding are ignored, compounding has the impact of dramatically raising the cost of our government. The state's unfunded pension liabilities now, just for the state pensions, total over $97 billion in Illinois. The Civic Federation's contribution to the State Budget Crisis Task Force focused on the capital cost, the infrastructure cost of our state and local government. And we estimated, and it's included in the report, that in the next 30 years, the state of Illinois and our local governments need about $300 billion in infrastructure funding. Some of you may have seen Mayor Emanuel's post-election editorial in the Washington Post, where he highlighted infrastructure investment as the key to jumpstart our economic recovery and protect the middle class. What we're seeing in Illinois is Illinois risks losing a lot on that economic opportunity because all of our available revenue and political will is bogged down by these legacy costs. As the nation emerges from this recession, it remains to be seen whether the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago will participate in that recovery or if we'll be dragged down by these legacy costs. So I just want to provide some very brief introductions about our esteemed panel. We have Phil Ashton, who's an associate professor of urban planning and policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His current research focuses on Chicago's more infamous legacy costs, the parking meter lease as one of those examples, the roles of investment banking and the infrastructure funds in the role of infrastructure funds and investment banks in urban infrastructure. We have Forrest Claypool, who probably, as most of you interested in government, most of you interested in transportation, doesn't need very much of an introduction. But he is currently the president of the Chicago Transit Authority. He's the former superintendent, since going several years back, of the Chicago Park District, and was an elected member of the Cook County Board of Commissioners. He has firsthand experience not only with wrestling with difficult policy issues, but trying to work through the implementation of them. We have David Merriman, who is a professor and associate director here at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs. He also co-directs the University of Illinois' Fiscal Futures Project and is a regular analyst and commentator on state and local government finances. And finally, to my immediate left, we have Richard Nathan, who's the former director of the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Prior to that, he was a professor at Princeton University, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and had served as an assistant director in the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. Mr. Nathan is also a member of the State Budget Crisis Task Force, which is chaired, as I mentioned, chaired by Richard Ravitch and Paul Volcker, and has recently published a report not only on the impact across the country, but breakout reports, one on California and one on Illinois that was recently released. So, because we are so analytically driven and so data conscious, we'll begin alphabetically. Bill is going to give a short reaction or a short intro to the topic.
Thanks, Lawrence. And I'm going to begin my remarks regarding legacy costs, taking off from Professor Nathan's analysis and Lawrence's introduction, with the question of whether or not the cure is worse than the disease. And my concern is really that we run the risk of looking for short-term fixes to legacy costs that do substantial harm over the long run. And I'll elaborate this concern from the perspective of infrastructure, which is an area where I've been doing some research with some colleagues at the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at UIC. Increasingly, attempts to address the legacy costs within infrastructure have involved public-private partnerships, or what are often referred to as P3s. The range of P3s can be quite broad, and they involve a variety of different public and private configurations to deal with aging infrastructure or to ensure new investment. A significant trend within the P3 world, though, has been the turn to long-term leases, or what are referred to as asset sales, to private sector operators. Chicago was an early innovator in this realm by selling its brownfield or existing assets, ironically during the boom years in the 2000s, and long-term leases on the Skyway and subsequent deals for the underground parking system, for the street parking meter system, and the attempted privatization of Midway all helped shape the US market for brownfield infrastructure assets. Since the onset of the Great Recession, there hasn't really been any lag in interest in these deals. Instead, there's been what we might call a supply push, that is, cash-strapped localities that are looking to transform their long-term revenue streams into upfront payments in order to fill fiscal gaps or to raise cash. In extreme circumstances like Michigan or Pennsylvania, these have been promoted as emergency measures to deal with the imminent insolvency of local governments. These moves are attractive for, I think, a number of obvious reasons. They produce immediate cash infusions for localities. They reduce long-term operating expense commitments. They allow the retirement of debt to improve municipal credit ratings. And they can be used to leverage new investment and improve efficiency. But I think that there are a number of causes for concern that we need to pay close attention to in the recent wave of infrastructure deals. And I'll highlight three sets of concerns that I think are sort of current ones. First, there are the standard criticisms that focus on the lack of transparency in decision-making. So the deals themselves often are inked without substantial public input or oversight and or on extremely rushed timetables. And that's one set of concerns I think that has gotten a lot of play within the media. For my colleagues and I, though, the way in which this market for infrastructure assets has developed has raised a number of concerns. To quote the bar, you don't get something for nothing. And high bid prices have been accompanied by contractual terms that seem overly generous to bidders or that potentially expose the city to long-term risks. It's clear that the recent generation of buyers of infrastructure assets are not attracted to long-term ownership and management, but rather the extraction of maximum short-term payouts. Finally, I think the idea that these deals shift costs and risks off of the public sector is somewhat illusory. And I think we see that when we look around at the question of saturation. So the analogy here is TIF. What might make sense for a single deal has unexpected consequences when you multiply it a dozen times or more. So the question, either from a fiscal point of view or from an economic development point of view, of what happens when we turn to privatization over and over again as part of the solution set for cash-strapped localities. Do we blindly end up swapping one set of legacy costs for another? Thank you.
Forrest.
Well, first, I'd like to say I was very impressed with Mr. Nathan's white paper, and I see this four financial legacy strategies playing out rather dramatically in the agency I inherited 18 months ago, and frankly, what Mayor Emanuel inherited 18 months ago when he came into office. This week, I submitted a balanced budget. It took us 18 months to do so. We started with a $309 million deficit on a $1.39 billion budget. And because it was so large and because we were starting anew, we literally had to punt the first year and buy time and not submit a balanced budget the first year to give us 18 months to actually tackle the job. But every penny of that $309 million deficit was a product of the items that Mr. Nathan has presented here. Pension and benefits, well over $100 million of the deficit was a product of fixing, that's the appropriate word, CTA's underfunded pension system, the disinvestment in infrastructure, maintenance of the infrastructure, and in the cost of entitlements. Legislators creating mandates on the CTA, as they like to do without funding them. Every penny of that $309 million, the fiscal crisis that the CTA faced, and threat again of yet another doomsday scenario of dramatic service cuts, fare hikes, and the like. The specter of that was a direct resultant cause of these very issues that we're discussing today, so it's very relevant. And Mayor Emanuel is facing similar issues, carrying infrastructure issues, pension time bombs. The Chicago Tribune has referred to him as Mayor Hurt Locker because he has to essentially come into office and defuse a whole series of bombs without blowing up himself or the city. And one of them was at the CTA. Others are at the school board, police and fire, city. He's fixing them one by one as we have at the CTA. But it's a very difficult process. And at the same time, we have to essentially have to walk and chew gum at the same time, though, because just even as you're dealing with digging out of huge fiscal issues that are caused by those issues we're discussing here today, we have to modernize and invest in the future of the city of Chicago. And that means modernizing our infrastructure and doing what wasn't done in the past, stopping disinvestment, making investment, creating jobs, creating productivity, building a modern, efficient infrastructure so we can continue to make Chicago a great world-class city.
Thanks. David?
Thanks. I want to echo Forrest's thanks to Dick Nathan for writing the paper and pointing out a number of different kinds of legacy costs. I want to talk specifically about pensions. That's the one I've been working on the most, and that's also the one at the forefront, certainly in the discussion in Illinois. And so the first point I want to make I want to make 3 points about pensions. So the first point I want to make is that we know the basic outlines of what the solution is going to look like. The solutions of the legacy cost is going to involve three parties, or transferring costs under three groups. One group is the people who own the pension liability, so the pensioners themselves. They're probably going to take some hit. The second group is the employers, so the school districts or the universities. And the third group is the taxpayers in general. What's holding up a solution now is how are we going to distribute those costs between those three groups. It's time to make a decision. Delay hurts us. Delay hurts us in recruiting, delay hurts us in retention, delay hurts us in terms of being able to pay our bills to our creditors, delay hurts us in terms of our reputation. All right, we know what the basic, it's going to be a battle over this power, but it's time to make a decision. Second point I want to make is the problem of legacy cost is sometimes perceived to be about the failure of government, and people shake their head and say government can't do anything right. I want to remind you that the term legacy cost first became popular with the auto industry and the GM having huge legacy costs. The problem developed in the private sector. It's widespread in the private sector. The way it was solved in the private sector was two things. One, there was bankruptcy, and so some of the cost was pushed on the stockholders, some of the cost was pushed on to the pension owners, and some of the cost was pushed on to the general public in the form of subsidies. Going forward, we tried to solve that problem with regulatory reform. We have a pension benefit guarantee corporation that tries to do that. We have tighter regulation. I think it's unrealistic to believe that the government is going to be able to patrol itself. Different levels of government are going to be able to patrol itself much better than the private sector did. I think we're going to have to develop mechanisms to force discipline in the government sector if we want to avoid this kind of legacy problem and future kind of legacy problems. And it's time to get thinking real seriously about what those mechanisms are. The third point I'd say, I guess the beginning of a mechanism to deal with the problem is, I think one of the reasons these legacy problems have grown to the size that they have is a lack of transparency in the way budgets are presented, the way we had unfunded liabilities that weren't fully recognized. We've made actually some progress in kind of very technical sense, in that there's a thing called the Government Accounting Standards Boards, which most people probably have never heard of. But it's really changed the standards, changed the way local governments have to count their liabilities. And I think that's a good thing. We need certainly to go further than that. And I think we probably need some basic changes in the way legislators are presented with numbers, presented with functions. But I think that's a direction we have to go in the future.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. When Michael Pagano asked me to write this paper, I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I'd like to know more about that. And the more I dug into it and developed the classification that's in the paper and looked at examples, the more it led me to a conclusion very similar to David's and what he just said about the importance of having institutional mechanisms to deal with fiscal irresponsibility at a time when at every level of government, Washington, states, local, there are tremendous pressures on the public fisc. Now, why is that? One reason that it exists is that the economy has changed. We're not producing jobs at the fast rate that we'd like to, and a lot of the jobs we're producing are low-wage, part-time jobs. The world has changed. The economies of other countries affect us in fundamentally different ways. So now what we're hearing about more and more at every level of government is austerity and legacies and changes. You have to eat your vegetables and you have to do this. This morning I listened hard. I thought the program was terrific to hear from this cross-section of leaders in state and local government. They used the word legacy 12 times. I counted. I was listening and learning just as I'm sure all of you are. And what I think about as I reflect on my experience so far working on this paper is that we do need to know better what's happening to public finance. There are only 87,000 governments in the country, according to the Census Bureau. I am a member, as the chairman just said, of the Dick Ravitch, Paul Volcker task force. And the Richard Ravitch presented a report here in Chicago on Illinois, which is one of the 6 states we're studying, based heavily on David's work at UIC to study state finances here. Illinois is a poster child for problems of what you did before and now how are you going to live with it. The pension problem that this state faces is not different from what a lot of other governments face and what we're going to do about it. I heard this morning about the House Bill 6258. And David mentioned the 3 groups that would be affected. I want to know more, and we're going to learn more because this is a broad-based problem for public officials and for public services, and it raises all kinds of, Mr. Ashton said, of fundamental questions of what we need to do and want to do, and what we're capable of doing, and how we're going to put our house in order. At the end of my paper, I have a set of recommendations that there be a system for getting good information from independent sources, scorekeeping on state and local finances, the way the Congressional Budget Office does, and is trusted. I'd like to talk more about that, but my time is up.
So just a couple of questions for each of the panelists before we open it up, and there are people circulating to take your questions that will be presented to them. Phil, you raised the issue about tax increment financing, and I got a little disconnected because it seemed like you were saying that it's tied to privatization. I didn't really understand that connection.
No, I think the analysis of, right, tax increment financing makes a lot of sense on a deal-by-deal basis. It's an easy way to sort of leverage current investments on the basis of future property tax growth. That's a different take on the program than when you've got 25% of your tax base invested in tax increment finance districts. Right? It's a different kind of fiscal problem, and it brings a different fiscal dimension to the problem when you've got TIF proliferating on such a large scale. The question I think that the city, and the city of Chicago and other municipalities face is, as the pressures to turn towards privatization become more compelling, right, as the attractions of infrastructure asset sales become more compelling, do we essentially take more and more of the revenue sources, long-term revenue sources, off of the table, and in the long run produce a revenue base for the city that is less resilient because it doesn't have potentially, right, we don't have parking meters on the table. That's probably not as much of an issue, right, on a deal-by-deal basis, but when we start to add in all those revenue sources, are we looking at a scenario 30, 50 years down the road where, because these involve long-term leases of 75 to 99 years, are we looking at a city, in fact, that has produced fiscal capacity that is much more constrained?
When you combine something like the privatization of the parking meters, which, although the Civic Federation didn't have the opportunity to weigh in because it passed so quickly, I think there are some things that were clear. The role of the parking meters in terms of controlling traffic in the city is something that everybody would recognize. I don't think that without that influx of private investment, I don't think the city of Chicago had the capacity within its budget to free up all those kiosks and then not allow you to use credit cards. How do you measure what the foregone cost or the expense of not investing in the infrastructure, not modernizing? Because you could say the same thing about the Skyway privatization, long-term lease, but the city is no longer obligated for maintaining it, and it has to be returned to it in good condition.
Sure, and I think those are really valuable points, and I don't think, right, the current environment for infrastructure investment is not a very happy one, and the mayor is as articulate an analyst to that as anyone. I think the question is really what do you give up, right? So we did $100 million or $200 million on the outside for investments in parking meter technology. What in fact do we have to give up in order to leverage that? And in this case, we gave up, right, 75-year lease. We gave up terms like maximum terms, of course, if you're not living under a rock for the last 6 months or 12 months. We gave up things like this notion of a compensation event, where anytime a street parking spot is closed to revenue for the concessionaire, it needs to be compensated at the maximum revenue generating potential. Right? Those are some terms that are buried in the agreement that, in retrospect now, that may not have been the best way to raise that money. And maybe there would have been other options that now that we're talking about infrastructure trust and partnership arrangements, maybe there are other ways. And I noticed that there are some things that are coming out of CTA with Ventura, that maybe there are other models, and I think that we owe ourselves investigation of those models rather than sort of buying into what seemed to be exactly what the concessionaires wanted at the time.
Four things. I think that's a nice segue into what you're seeing at the CTA. In particular, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, as Mr. Nathan talks about, the legacy mandates of entitlements. And so you're subject to all sorts of good ideas that come out of Springfield and the city council as to what the fare should be and who should ride for free.
Right.
How does that impact?
Right. That's really the core of all this. Is Mr. Nathan's points is that whether it's pensions, politicians love to, they have over the decades, they love to sweeten pension benefits for themselves and for members of labor unions who support their reelection, but they don't want to actually fund those promises. And that's how we got into this mess. They like to cut ribbons on shiny new buildings, but they don't want to actually spend the money to maintain them because that would require them to sacrifice other things. And that's how we got to the infrastructure issues. And on the mandates, they like to use other governments as piggy banks for their programs so they can take a vow on behalf of senior citizens or veterans or whoever the case may be and get the plaudits, but they don't want to actually pay for those programs. They want to pass the cost down through law to someone else who has to deal with it. So CTA is a great example of all of those things. And on the mandates point that Lawrence mentioned, the CTA is mandated by law, city, state, federal, to provide more than $100 million a year in free and heavily discounted rides to more than 16 different groups. That's a classic example. And all worthy, no doubt, all got somebody in this re-election commercial, but not paid for. So actually it is paid for. There's nothing that's not really paid for. The CTA as average fare, when you take all these discounted free rides in, is actually $1.60, even though $2.10 is what everyone else pays. So the cost really is to our other riders who have to pay a higher fare, obviously, or it shows up in the massive deficits that we inherited in the doomsday scenarios and the service cuts that you've seen over the years. So it does get paid for, but not in the way that it should be paid.
David, you talked about the private sector experience and how the public sector sort of followed the same trend in terms of the legacy cost. What do you see as the potential for the referee for state and local governments? We're watching here in Illinois as our legislature finds, all sorts of different ways to not just the can's too big to kick it down the road, but we're prepared to roll it as far as we go.
So I think that's a really difficult question. It's much more difficult in the public sector than it is in the private sector. On the local government basis, state governments have regulated local government debts for many years, and the IMRF is one example of a pension program where the state government regulates local governments that actually fund it. For state government, I think we're going to have the federal government work with it, and I think federal government is not, because of constitutional restrictions, is not going to be able to demand that states fully fund their pensions. But I think the federal government can use incentives, just as Medicaid, we have a cost-sharing basis. Federal government, just as we do for highway programs, the federal government, I think, can get into the business of saying we have a national interest in states not accumulating large legacy costs, and we can think about policies that might encourage states to be more responsible with federal government. And Dick suggested some. I think Dick suggested only very modest policies. We might think about more stringent policies. At the federal level, I'm still scratching my head, I have to admit, what we're going to do about that.
Richard, in terms of what you've seen as a former federal budget official, what is the ability of the federal government to referee where the state should be on their legacy costs if the federal government doesn't have the money itself to influence it?
That's a big subject and a federalism question that is fundamental. And David raises it in a way that suggests things that would be really path-breaking, like on pensions. I mean, some states have problems, and local governments of the character of the problems here in Illinois. Other states don't. Now, if you're talking about some kind of a incentive program that's going to provide funding and standards for the states in trouble, that raises all kinds of questions about, well, why should these states who did it to themselves be bailed out? Now, there is a pension, and David maybe would speak to this, there is the Pension Benefit Corporation for workouts when private companies are bankrupt. Now, states can't be bankrupt. Local governments can be, but states can't be. So I think he opens a very good and extremely difficult question of new relationships between the federal government and the states in ways that would involve equities among states, and then the actual ins and outs and operations of how would you do it, who would supervise it, who would make it happen.
Any of the other panelists want to react to that basic idea? It just seems enormously challenging to me to think that as we prepare for the fiscal cliff and what that means, that the federal government would be able to, would it have a will? I mean, I don't even think the Illinois congressional delegation would necessarily support a federal bailout of the state's underfunded pension liability.
Well, I would add just one quick comment. I'll jump in. The fiscal cliff may be a slope, but what's really out there is a $16,360 billion U.S. government federal deficit. That is not going to it's not going to be possible to live with that. So what we're really talking about is bargaining about a bargain where the feds, by sequestration and by budget cuts and by tax measures, will do things that put the federal government on the kind of a path all governments should be on and this state government should be on. At that time, what's going to happen is there's going to be less federal money. You're right. Not more federal influence and more federal support. So I think it is hard to see how that could happen, and yet it raises a question that I think we all should take a hard look at.
Lawrence, if I could just, first of all, I think somebody said this morning that the state of Illinois is in worse shape than the federal government is. I think that's misinformed. I go to national conferences in which we have state and local papers and we have federal papers presented about what the fiscal problem is. And believe me, state and local, as hard as it is, it's not as bad as the federal government. And it's exactly the thing Dick's saying. It's really healthcare costs, and in particular, Medicare. In terms of the federal government, how realistic is it to expect the federal government to get involved in the legacy costs of the state governments? I think one thing is it doesn't necessarily have to involve federal bailouts. It could involve going forward more conditionality of some of the grants that are already being done. And the other point that I make is, if you look at Europe, you look at the European Union, isn't that enough incentive to say, maybe we don't want that to happen here, right? You've got, European countries, Southern European countries on the verge of bankruptcy. That's going to cause a problem for Europe in its entirety. The same thing could happen in the United States. So I think there's lots of incentive for the federal government to get serious about this issue and think that there's really a strong national interest. Exactly what is the design of the program that works, I don't know, but I think the federal government ought to take it seriously and ought to realize that they have to encourage states on fiscal discipline.
I know we're collecting other questions. Forrest, did you want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the federal response to your infrastructure request or infrastructure needs, and how that folds into the fiscal challenges of either the federal government or the state government?
The federal government does supply an annual appropriation to transit agencies around the country for capital, not operating. There's no operating support from the federal government, but for capital. And over the years, the CTA, like probably many transit agencies, has bonded out or used some of that annualized income stream and bonded it out. So the amount that's available to us now on a discretionary basis is really rather low, probably $70 million a year. So we're hopeful that if there's a new transit bill that will go up. It did go up slightly in the 2-year bill that was created, but that's really obviously though not going to be the solution. There's tremendous resistance to raising the gas tax at a time of high gas prices, as you might suspect. Another problem in politics, in addition to the issues we raised here today, when gas prices are low, you'd think that'd be the optimal time to add to the gas tax, but it doesn't happen. And then when gas prices are high, you need the dollars that the gas tax funds for capital and infrastructure. There's too much political heat to do it. So another quandary in the system. And so I don't see, for that reason, the federal government being the answer to improving infrastructure. We're going to do it on our own. We're going to have to help on our own. Now, to the credit of Governor Quinn, the state stepped up with a 5-year capital program. Frankly, we'd be in a lot of trouble without that, and that's why I give kudos to the governor and the state for that. Mayor Emanuel's been very aggressive in leveraging other sources for capital. as we need to rebuild our system. And we're CTA ourselves are going to go into the market because we have to, because for many, many reasons. For example, we came in, and this gets this issue of disinvestment in infrastructure. We came in, our busiest and most important rail line, the red line, is the stretch south between 22nd Street and 95th Street. It's taking Southside commuters 20 minutes longer to get anywhere. Slow zones, 15 miles an hour, 40% of the line growing to 60%, spending millions and millions of dollars a year just to patchwork it, and there was absolutely no plan whatsoever to rebuild it. So working with the governor, working with the mayor, we're going to rebuild that line next year, but that process is just beginning of rebuilding and modernizing infrastructure, and it's going to come at a cost that has previously been consumed by day-to-day expenses. For example, the CTA borrowed $500 million, that's a B, over the last 5 years to pay for operating expenses, just to cover operating shortfalls. And a lot of that money came out of its capital budget, came out of its federal funds, came out of its state funds. And so instead of having a modern system, we had a declining, deteriorating system, poor service, higher costs. And those are the challenges that Mayor Emanuel is facing. Those are the challenges we face now at CTA. But we're going to have to do it ourselves here locally, a combination of local and state, because I don't think the federal government is going to ride to the rescue.
And we do have some questions from the audience, and we'll continue to take them if you want to put them forward. First, to all of you, or whoever wants to respond first, what role does the proliferation of local governments in Illinois play in causing or solving the problem? Could government consolidation help? And just for a little background, of course, we have 6,998 units of local government in Illinois, which is more than twice any other state. Pennsylvania has about 3,000 units of government. So we throw that question open. I think it's a great question, especially in light of we had this very significant income tax increase, and there was no discussion about consolidation during that debate. We just moved forward on the increase. So, does anyone have any reaction to government consolidation? Our challenges are not big enough. We want to find the other hot buttons to put them on. In case of public transit, we have 4 different entities involved in our public transit. We have the RTA, which serves as the finance umbrella. We let Metro operate separately, PACE operate separately, and the CTA operate separately. Are there efficiencies that could come from consolidation?
Well, I mean, I don't know if consolidations are so different. I mean, there are issues, and I mentioned this, for example, the RTA was created 37 years ago. The legislature put a cap on its spending because they feared that it would grow as bureaucracies tend to do when they're created. And today the RTA spends twice what the legislature authorized it to spend by law. So a good example, just classic bureaucracy. That's dollars that aren't going into service. That's dollars that are being spent on, really nothing that could go into direct service, either lower fares, increased buses and train service. So there's always those issues. Obviously, the plethora of governments, the plethora of regulatory bodies that never go away once created. Clearly those are issues. But I would say government is like a ratchet. It only moves in one direction. It grows and grows. Once it's there, displacing it, bringing it back, getting rid of it is almost impossible. So maybe one of the lessons is don't let government grow.
Richard, in your paper, you talked about local government and being too layered, too fragmented, and really too diverse to really track the financial implications of those individual decisions. Do you see consolidation as something that in other places around the country that has been beneficial, or?
There's tremendous variation, and there are cases, and you make a good point, that when you have some leverage, you can incorporate changes in government structure as a way to incent people to make changes. And again, Illinois is out front. You are up at the top of the list. And I think that it was mentioned this morning by one of the speakers that it's very hard to do. These governments have employees, and they have elected officials, and basketball games, whatever it may be. that is important to that community and to that group of people. There's also an argument in economics, the so-called public choice argument, that says it makes sense to have different service sheds for different public functions. So consolidation in Illinois for sure is a good idea, but it isn't always the answer. That's the only point I'd make additionally.
Phil, maybe this question I think is right to your wheelhouse. The questioner asked, Illinois recently, I assume a state representative or senator, introduced legislation for a publicly owned infrastructure bank, similar to something that's been started in North Dakota. Among the other economic development measures, is this a good idea for the state to be looking at an infrastructure bank? Certainly we have maybe comment on the cities beginning to establish an infrastructure bank.
I think infrastructure banks are obviously one of the solutions that's been proposed at the national level also by the Obama administration. I think there's a lot of possibility there. Certainly in terms of finding lowest cost forms of debt, that is an option for raising that kind of debt. I think obviously the Civic Federation would share concerns that a lot of analysts would share, that in some ways debt is debt, and cities in many ways are reaching the outer limits of the kinds of debt that they can take on without some new and creative ways of sharing that. So I think in Chicago, certainly the infrastructure trust and the partnership approach to investment, where it's not just simply the city borrowing, but it's identifying the revenue streams as a part of that, or potential efficiencies out of those investments that then can be wrapped up in a deal. I think that's important. What I think is also important, though, at the state level, or state or national level, the state level, I guess, is not just a source of financing, but also some rules for the game. When we talk about the proliferation of local governments, one of the things that has come around in the development of the infrastructure privatization market over the last decade is a little bit of a race to the bottom, where the terms of the deals just don't seem to get any better as municipalities seem to be getting smarter about bidding. So, the idea that we would end up with deals that are only 50 years as opposed to 75 or 99 years, that doesn't seem to be developing. And I think there is a role at the state level, not just in providing maybe these creative forms of finance, but also in establishing some frameworks for bargaining. And the earlier generations of privatization, places like Virginia, they treated public utilities they treated infrastructure like a public utility. So if you were going to engage in privatization, it was your prerogative to do so as a locality, but there were some groundworks in terms of what an ideal deal looked like and how toll increases were going to be regulated, so that it really wasn't just a rush to the bottom. So I think in some ways the conversation about statewide initiatives should have both of those elements.
Anyone else on infrastructure issues? This is sort of a very broad question, but I think it's provocative. Which is worse, delaying debt reduction to pay for literally crumbling infrastructure, or closing said infrastructure service to reduce debt?
Well, the latter, I would say clearly. Look, one of the problems is that delaying disinvestment is how that affects growth. And growth, of course, affects revenues paid down the debt. And that's something President Obama has been trying to get through the heads of Mr. Boehner and others in Washington. But we can create jobs in the short term, and we can improve our productivity in the long term. That's true at Chicago Transit Authority, it's true nationally. But growth is really the answer to pay down these debts. And I'm not saying this is the panacea, it's not. But we can't just neglect the fundamental elements of infrastructure. Now, of course, it also means we have to make sure those investments are smart, that they actually are tied to growth, not just another shiny new building or something that really doesn't ultimately lever economic growth and productivity.
I think there is probably no doubt on this panel the importance of growth, whether it's economic growth, population growth, and this is an urban forum, and I think not enough attention, not enough political attention is paid to the importance of urban growth. You mentioned, Forrest, the fact that the federal government does not provide any operating assistance. That's a relatively new phenomenon. 20 or so years ago, you go back, the major these public transit programs in the major cities receive federal assistance. That was one way of helping to cover with the cost of those legacy mandates that they would. But I think, for those of us that are invested in Chicago, it's still a message that doesn't really even make it all the way down to Springfield. And one of the amazing things is that you have a Chicago-dominated leadership in Springfield, and yet the issues of the Chicago Transit Authority, the Chicago Public Schools, the City of Chicago's pension and police and fire pensions have to be bargained for from step one. That there isn't going to be enough money to trade off what we need to do in Chicago with what they need to do in Mechanicsburg, Illinois. I mean, there is a lack, in my opinion, of recognition, especially among many political actors, some of which are from Chicago, as to the importance of urban growth and supporting infrastructure.
No question. John Norquist, who wrote a book called The Wealth of Cities, talks about how cities have always been the engines of human progress because their principal assets are density and diversity, and it's that density that creates the energy and brings people together with great skill and passion and intellectual, whether it's the arts or whether it's commerce, to feed off each other, to create ideas, to build things. Cities have always been the engines of human progress, and things like great transit systems, which are the arteries of that commerce and make it happen, they're important to business. There's a very little understanding of those connections. I agree with that. There's a diminution of the importance of cities as the economic engines, really, of regions, and Chicago certainly is the economic engine of this region.
David, you mentioned that you attend a lot of conferences nationally and meet with other people from around the country. When they approach you and you introduce yourself as from the University of Illinois, what is the general reaction to that in terms of the challenges that we face? Do they think we're far apart from them, or do they the same boat?
I would say that the people who are informed about the sort of state fiscal problems, are kind of shocked at how badly we have handled our finances in Illinois, and they want to know, how did you get into this? And I have to start with a history that goes back 25 years or so. So that's kind of the impression.
Phil, yesterday, and I think it was the Wall Street Journal, there was an editorial about the city of Detroit and what has happened in Detroit. The last line in that editorial said, it's horrible in Detroit, and it could happen in Chicago. And what I wondered from your perspective, having worked in Newark and been involved in urban revitalization efforts, what do you see in that statement related to Chicago?
Well, in some ways, this gets back to the question of growth, right? And I think underlying the subtext of some of this conversation has really been some different opinions about what growth is going to look like when it comes back, right? And I think, certainly there was, I think, a subtext in Professor Nathan's paper that really we're potentially facing a radically different regime of growth, where we can expect lower overall increases in GDP, and that's going to trickle down to large cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, whatever the case may be. That's, I think, that's an important argument to take seriously. An alternative argument would be that this is really a temporary downturn, and that we can look forward to renewed growth if we are smart about it. Certainly, Chicago is not Detroit in the sense of our economy is much more diverse. We have many more different sectors that are engines of growth here. So I'm not sure I would put Chicago and Detroit in the same conversation, but I would, I think, put on the table the question of, all right, if we are going to be in a better position in 5 years, and a better position overall and a better position in Detroit, where is that going to come from, and how does the management of legacy costs fit into that? I mean, do we do ourselves a disservice by putting, for instance, in Dave's formulation, do we do ourselves a disservice by placing more of the cost for managing the pension crisis on the backs of pension owners in such a way that causes, for instance, Chicago teachers or public servants to go elsewhere? Right? Do we, in fact, through the management of a short-term fiscal issue, turn it into a longer-term economic development issue where we can't really, we don't have the investments in public capacity to help incentivize growth?
May I make a comment? And I'd like to ask David a question in this connection, if I can do both. In the budgeting field, when you're first learning about budgeting or teaching about budgeting, you turn to Aaron Wildowski's work, Incremental Budget. You start with the base, and then you figure, what are you going to add? What we're facing, and this is not easy for our political system, is decremental budget. Where states have gotten, or cities, or now the national government, into situations where the long term doesn't look strong enough to avoid really having to make these hard choices. They are never made in a way that reflects the kind of full, careful, cost-benefit planning, very good and full discussion that the public process, you'd like to have in the public process. I'd like to piggyback the question to David. 62, House 6258, you said there are 3 groups that are going to be affected and that this law is flowing along. It seems to me that Illinois is right up there, and everybody is looking at what's happening here. The 3 groups are the pensioners, the employers, and the taxpayers. What kind of a blend of provisions are envisioned in what seems to be what's being worked on?
I think one of the problems is we really don't know, because I think the changes in the pensions that are envisioned, we have claims about the cost savings, but we don't have really good details. So I really don't know how those shares are going to work out, but I think that's the discussion. I think that's the way the discussion should be framed much more than the details of exactly how you get there. Probably less important than, okay, let's decide what's a fair way to divide it between these 3 groups. And then there's lots of ways we can, operationalize that. It's a little bit unsatisfying, so I can't really tell you what the answer is.
But I think it points to, up until very recently, the debate over pensions and the type of reforms, and there was very little transparency as to the impact that those changes would have before they were voted on and passed into law. They were done in Illinois in a very rapid fashion. Yesterday, there was a group of about a dozen members of the Illinois General Assembly, including the chairman of the House Pension Committee, that unveiled an actual bill, which is unusual in Illinois, that we actually get to see the bill before we're asked whether or not it's a good idea to pass it, and contains some very significant changes. They're pledging, the coalition led by Elaine Neckwitz and Representative Biss from Northbrook are pledging that they will allow, they're asking the state pension funds to provide the actuarial information before they vote on it. What's clear to me on first blush, it is a broad attempt at sharing the pain between the beneficiaries, the existing employees, not much on the retirees, but then again, the tax and the funding answer isn't there, because these changes, which are going to significantly impact the unfunded liability of the state, will not eliminate the unfunded liability. And all of the position the state of Illinois has gotten itself in is everything they do is going to be painful and hard if they're going to survive this. So we can make dramatic changes to the benefit. Dramatic changes, in the case of what's proposed, is that the automatic 3% increase for retiree pensions only is applied to the first $25,000 of the pension. It's not taking away what that benefit is. It's not taking away what's been earned with the future growth of it. Employees are going to be asked to contribute up to 2% more to the pension. The state's going to promise to make a more significant commitment to funding. Whether that will be enough to make future General Assemblies follow that pledge is going to be debated. And there was a question here on the constitutionality of the state constitution as it relates to pensions. And literally, how might reducing pension benefits impact the Illinois economy? I wanted to get to the second part. What about the constitutionally protection clause for Illinois pensions? Without a doubt, any changes in the state pension system is going to be litigated in courts. We'll never really know until the issue is brought to the state Supreme Court. It would be better to get this resolved sooner rather than later, because if we can't change the benefits going forward for these, it's very difficult to see how we're going to fund them, but if we can't change them, then that's a much different discussion. Does anyone want to respond to the idea that changing or reducing state or local government pension benefits, how that might impact the Illinois economy in the long term?
I think it's likely to have a relatively minor effect on the economy. I know this isn't a popular answer with some people, but if pensioners get a lower income and somebody else is going to pay lower taxes, the net effect of that is pretty small in terms of the economy. So I don't think it's a discussion that's not a good defense of pension benefits because we want to stimulate the economy.
Phil, this question was directed to you. They're asking, there was a press comment that the parking meter deal was about $1 billion short. I assume that means that the city received $1 billion less than it should have. And their question to you is that accurate?
I haven't seen that analysis. Well, my colleagues and I at CUPA have been doing some work on deals like the parking meter, and in some ways I think we have to distinguish between sort of the market value, the value of the cash flow, potential cash flow, and the investment value, the value of that investment to a consortium like the Morgan Stanley, that consortium about the parking meters. And it's clear from our analysis that the investment values of these concession deals are quite high. And they're high because, not because Morgan Stanley knows how to run parking meters better than the city does. They're high because financial engineering techniques allow them to front load the payments to equity investors so they get their money back in 15 years. And that's why in the case of the Skyway, the range of bids in the Skyway, the winning bid was $1.8 billion. The bids came in the high 100 millions. I mean, there was a significant spread in the bids, and that wasn't because the engineering companies that were bidding as if they were going to operate it as an infrastructure asset don't know what they're doing. It's because they really didn't understand the capacity to manipulate the cash flows in such a way to produce a much higher rate of return for investors. And I think that's where we get into some of the issues with valuation. The value to Morgan Stanley may well be $2 billion or more. I don't know those numbers; those are proprietary to Morgan Stanley. But that does involve a number of techniques on Morgan Stanley's part that really are worrisome because they leverage the asset with debt. They, in cases of downturns in the economy, they make it much more likely that there's going to be delinquency or default. And Chicago hasn't experienced that yet, but places like Denver and San Diego have. The South Bay Expressway, which was a Macquarie asset, is just emerging out of bankruptcy, where the city essentially had to buy, the county of governments, in San Diego, had to buy back the asset right out of default because it was over leveraged and wasn't able to meet its obligations. So, I don't know that specific numbers, but I think in some ways the question kind of gets at some of the underlying problems in these deals.
And I think again, it also inherent in that is trying to figure out if you as a private vendor operating it will have more will or political ability to raise fares, raise rates, and that's exactly what we saw in the parking meter.
Well, those are in. I mean, in the case of the Skyway, those are in the deal. I mean, so it's, there should be no illusions that that's what's going on. Yeah.
Or should I'd like to add a previous question, because the question about the economy being affected by it. There's another way to look at it. The CTA is a way to look at it, because the CTA was the guinea pig for pension reform before the Great Recession. No one would consider what was done to the CTA before the Great Recession as pension reform today because of the impact of that recession. But another way to look at it, because of that, when we were force-fed, the CTA was force-fed, you're going to fully fund your pension. So today, 20% CTA contributes 20% of wages to the pension, 20%. Workers contribute between 10 and 11%. And our actuaries are forced to go up each year. This year we have another $32 million which had to be shared, and that will continue. In addition, we had to fund that, so the CTA went, this is not me, it's part I got there, went in the marketplace to fund that obligation. That's half of the CTA's current debt, which restricts our ability to make infrastructure investments that increase productivity, that create jobs. So essentially, if you don't have some sort of work balance, if you just protect the status quo, essentially you are going to have to make money back. I mean, our workers just got a much smaller raise than they're accustomed to because of those costs. They're taking home less money, they're spending less money in their neighborhoods. That's having less of a multiplier effect. So there's a negative effect as well, not having a balanced approach to pension reform, I think.
I think we have time for one last question, and it deals with federal infrastructure funding. The questioner asks, how are we going to be able to provide multi-year federal funding stream for large projects in Chicago, such as the CTA Blue Line reconstruction, when Congress has banned earmarks and is in such a short-term election?
That's a question.
The end of earmarks is how is that going to impact the CTA's infrastructure?
Well, it doesn't help, particularly because we have, hometown president of the United States, and number 2 leader of the United States Senator, a transportation secretary from Illinois. So normally, 20 years ago, we could have backed up Brinks from but they've changed the rules a lot. It's a lot harder. The earmarks was one of those ways where the process could be used to be helpful. A lot. Essentially, the Brown line was rebuilt on sort of an earmark type structure, even though, and that was an enormously important project. It's the fastest growing line. It's anchoring economic development on the northwest side. So I realize that there's transparency issues around earmarks. And I think the answer really was transparency. Transparency, I think, was probably the most important issue. That was absent in many, many instances. And there was a lot of use of earmarks to benefit private interests. So not defending that at all. But by the same token, we elect people for a reason. They have things that they know are important to their constituents that have to happen faster. We ought to give them some prerogatives. And it's analogous in some ways to the menu program that the mayors have always given the city council, that there's a certain amount of money that they can program for their constituents, so they can set their own priorities because they are elected. And that's what they're supposed to do.
I think that's a fine note to end on. You are all lucky to be here at the University of Illinois and in the state of Illinois, because you will see these issues basically playing out for the next indefinite future as we wrestle with these legacy costs. I'd like to thank the panel. I think you did a great job.